So, we're going to be talking about a lot of living things today that swim. We're going to be talking about fish. And you'll notice of all the 66,000 vertebrates in the world, half of them are fish. And there's elephants and there's snakes and there's birds, but half of all of those animals are fish. Now, water is home to fish like air is to us. So if you think about it, things that are in water, first of all, oxygen. Well, we get our oxygen by breathing through our lungs. A fish use their gills. There's salts in the water, just like there's salts in the food that we eat. And light penetrates into water. The farther down you go, the darker it gets. But temperature-wise, the temperature of water generally stays pretty much the same. In winter in a small pond, it can certainly get colder, but overall, there's different levels depending on how high and low you go in the water. It can also have toxic substances, just like we have air pollution. And that's runoff that can be things that run off your yard, motor oil, other things that get in the water. And then within that home, that watery home, they have to have, whatever lives there has to have a way of escaping from predators. So we're going to go through all of those, but let's think about what it would be like to us. So for us, what can go wrong in the air? Smoke. Just like there can be water pollution, smoke is air pollution. Light penetration. What do we do when it turns dark? What are our choices? How do we get away from smoke? How do we get away from the dark? Too cold or too hot? Mosquitoes are around. I want to get away from mosquitoes. And there's a bear in the yard and I need to escape that predator. So what we can do, you and I can do, we can go inside. We can get away. Fish, not so much. They don't have places they can go and shut the door. And animals, for that matter, not all animals can get away. Some animals have a hard time finding a place where they can go. In fact, most animals, unless they dig a hole, they're exposed. Fish breathe through gills. Not really breathe, but that's how they get their oxygen. So the water goes in through the mouth, where that finger is, and it comes out through the gills. And they're constantly flowing that in, just like you and I are breathing in and out. And so they absorb oxygen and they get rid of carbon dioxide just the way our lungs do. So you can see how much blood is flowing through those gills, through the little tiny capillaries. It'd be like if you put your hand up like this and you move it back and forth, and the oxygen or the water and extracting oxygen is coming between those fingers, and you have blood vessels in there. So those are how gills work. Fish have digestion just like you. They have a mouth where they take in food. It goes through the esophagus, or the tube that goes into the stomach. It goes through the intestine all the way, comes out the rectum and anus, and that's where their fecal material, their poop, comes. And so they're built very much like we are in that respect. Now, from a fisherman's point of view, the mouth can tell us an awful lot. So how many of you have ever seen something like this in say an aquarium, or in a home aquarium somebody has? I see some of you have seen this. And if you were over at Wonders of Wildlife, you'll see these, and look at that tiny little mouth. When the way they feed is they come nibbling along the coral that we see in the background here, and they're nibbling little algae and other things that are on that coral. So they have just these tiny little lips. That's all they really need. Here are 3 fish that you can find in Missouri. You've got the bluegill up here. It's got a very little small mouth. It eats fish, but little tiny fish, little tiny minnows. It eats insects, but it can't take on very big things. Here's a catfish at the bottom, and the catfish lives on down low, very frequently in kind of muddy or dark waters, and its mouth is pointed downward. It's not up like this. It's pointed downward because it's nibbling along the bottom grabbing up the things it is looking for, insects, fish eggs, fish. It also takes dead stuff and plants. In fact, a lot of the things that people use to catch them are dead stuff. The bass here, it's got a big mouth and it can take on virtually anything that it can get in its mouth. This was actually taken further downstream from on our creek by a photographer, an amateur photographer who was very good. And he had a number of magazine covers, and he would lay in the water, and talking about photographic technique, he would lay in the water with a snorkel for hours in a wetsuit, holding with a bag full of frogs or crawdads, and trying to lure a bass in, and then flip that bait out. And he managed to catch this just at the perfect time as the fish was just enveloping that frog. That was a prize-winning photograph. Now, let's think about light. Light has to penetrate into the water. Algae needs light to grow, just like trees need light to grow leaves and to grow their trunk. So algae, you're going to be talking a lot about algae this year, probably. And you're going to hear it good and bad. Algae like this, it can be too dense and it keeps the sunlight from coming in, takes away the oxygen because it eats up the oxygen in the water, can kill fish. On the other hand, most of the things that fish eat algae to grow, but so the fish can say insects. And so when we talk about that, is algae good or is it bad? Well, the answer almost always to a question like that is it depends. It depends on whether you happen to be an insect that eats algae or you happen to be a fish and you're not getting enough oxygen. So ordinarily, if I was here in the classroom, what I would be saying to you today is algae good or bad? And the Wolf class says out loud, everybody at one time, it depends. So let's try that. I'm just going to experiment with this and see if we can do it here. I'm going to wait for your answer. Is algae good or bad? It depends. Okay, since I can't hear you, I trust you said that. So we'll move on. Temperature. Water temperature changes very slowly, except during the winter, maybe it gets colder in a pond. People sweat. We change clothes. We go inside. Fish don't. They're stuck there. So they have their own preferred areas where they live. Largemouth bass like 65 to 75 degree water. Crappie 71, 75. Those are all numbers, but I'm just saying that to note that there are different places that you would catch fish, and if you know where they're going to be, you're going to have better luck in catching them. So warm water holds less dissolved oxygen. And so we're going to be talking about that at Bull Creek when you come down, that we want trees around streams to keep some of the sunlight off so there's more oxygen in the water for bass. Then there's toxic substance, water pollution. We go to a lot of trouble trying to get the pollutants out of our water and to prevent people from putting things in. That's just like having smoke and air pollution is to us when those pollutants get into the water. Then, and here's a good example of a little air pollution, smoking. Okay, then they need the opportunity to escape predators. I actually took this picture at Bull Creek, and there's this great blue heron was fishing out there and standing there, watching the water, and suddenly it put its beak quickly into the water and it came up, and I was able to snap this picture, and it's holding a small fish in its mouth. There's other things that get to them. Here's an otter. Otters like fish, and they can, if otters are in a pond, they can pretty much clean it out. But otters are a natural part of life. Snapping turtles will eat fish. This particular one was in a fishless pond. I don't know what he was doing there, but he can travel all the way over to the creek, which I'm sure he did. Osprey or fish hawks, black bears, especially up north in Canada, they eat lots of salmon during the salmon run. So fish have to have a way in which they can escape or hide. Now, fish anatomy, generally fish are bigger at the front half than they are at the back. We kind of torpedo shaped, we call it, but pointed so that when they're swimming into the water is parting and running over the back, and below they're streamlined and out to the tail. And the way they move, this is their motor here. That back part, it flips back and forth like that, like fins on your feet if you were wearing a swim gear. And the dorsal fin here holds them straight. So that's the thing that keeps the fish going straight forward. And these pectoral fins, that's this fins here, those are paddling. It's just like when you're canoeing, or when you will be canoeing, that's if you stroke on one side and not the other, it turns the fish. So it goes, makes its turn. So that's the way fish move. They also have a swim bladder. That bladder, it contains some air, and that way they can hold a certain place in the water without having to swim to struggle to stay up. Just like this little guy down here is not having to, he doesn't have to paddle to stay up. He's got his swim bladder here on his arms. So the skin of a fish is generally very tough, and you can get under it and peel it off like we do when you're cleaning a fish after you've caught fish. Most fish have scales, but some, like the catfish, have just the skin, a very tough, leathery skin. They have senses just like you and I have. Do they have a nose? Yes. Here's a nose just like ours. Well, looks a little different, but you get the idea. Catfish have these barbels, which are whiskers, and they are smell indicators just like the nose. Very tiny nose, but they smell with these barbels. And catfish live deep in the water along the bottom, and they prowl along the bottom, and so they're very reliant on their sense of smell, if you would, or their ability to pick up chemicals that way. So catfish eat small fish, seeds, aquatic plants. They eat algae, crawdads, snails, just pretty much anything they can find. Now, bass have bigger eyes, and those bigger eyes are important because it's a hunter, it's a predator, and it's frequently chasing fast-moving prey. And finally, there is what's called the lateral line on a fish, and that's these little tiny hairs. They're microscopic hairs along here where it can feel the pressure of water, the direction the water is going, and it can feel vibrations. So if you're fishing and you throw out a lure, it feels that jiggle and it turns around and say, what was that? Fish live in different levels. So minnows generally up in the shallows, particularly if there's a lot of weeds and brush, cattails, etc. Bluegill a little further down, crappie, largemouth bass will be in this open water zone. And then deeper down here is where the catfish likes to live. And you want to know that when you're fishing to know what kind of fish you might catch. If you come to a new place and you don't know what's there, you have to say, I wonder if they have any catfish here. I wonder if they have bass, and they would be fishing at a different level. So here are bass, which are roving predators. They're kind of like a lion or a tiger that is out looking for prey. The sunfish like to be in heavier cover. Trout require moving cold water. They're not native here. We brought them in, but they can survive in places like below dams where the water is cold and it's rushing in from the bottom of a lake. Catfish feed along the bottom, And fish like sculpin actually just lay on the bottom full time and barely move along, grabbing algae and stuff that sinks to the bottom. So all of these things would inform you where you want to fish and what you want to fish with. So here's a bluegill. They're great little fighters, eating insects, small fish, and crawdads. Fishing with them, probably the most efficient way of fishing is with a bobber using bait such as worms or grasshoppers. You can also fly fish, and we're going to be doing that later this year. And that's where you take take a hook with some things tied to it to make it look like an insect, and you try and fool the fish. And that's what fly fishermen do. They're trying to fool the fish and catch them that way. Crappie, they tend to be deeper down. They tend to be within vegetation when they can find it. They eat insects and small fish. When we fish for them, it can be with a bobber, with minnows, or you can use jigs, which again, are kind of like a fly, only they're a lead weight with stuff tied on them to make them look like a little minnow, or you can fasten a minnow on a jig. Those will be things that you'll be learning. Catfish, they are omnivorous. That means they're bottom feeders, and I didn't spell feeder very good there, did I, Barb?
No, you sure didn't. Looks like fetter to me.
She should have been checking me here. So they eat all kinds of material on the bottom. They're good eating, so they're something that we've looked for fish, for food. We have a friend that catches blue catfish. They can run up to 40 pounds. You can fish with them with a rod and reel and weighted bait, meaning put a lead weight to make the bait go down, or you can use trot or jug lines. I'll show you that in a minute. Bait, liver, worms, stink bait. There's stuff that just smells dead, but it attracts them. Cheese, some people use pieces of chicken. And then cold streams, trout, you have to be in an area where they've been stocked, and that's generally with fly fishing. Now, they're not native. As I mentioned, they were brought here in the 1880s and 1890s from Western North America, and then some from Europe. And then the largemouth bass, it's omnivorous. As I mentioned, it eats all kinds of stuff, and we use bobbers with worms if you wanted to, grasshoppers, but the main way is casting out lures, artificial things that are meant to fool the fish and get it to come up and grab the bait. Here's the northern pike, and they've been stocked. They're not native here, and they up north, they live in large cold water where they eat primarily fish and ducklings. They will chase baby ducks and eat them. They don't taste very good as far as food goes, but we use large artificial lures. You can see this spoon hanging out of this fish's mouth. So here's some of the ways of fishing we're going to be talking about. This is different kinds of bobbers that float above the water, and then you have something below, frequently weighted, that would be your bait. These are just a variety of the kinds of lures that fishermen use. Spoons for northern pike. This would be more for small fish. Here's for fly fishermen. There's a wide variety. We may bring some of those in sometime for you to see. And people fish for food. They fish for fun, personal fun, and for competition. So this is a bunch of people getting ready to go out all day long, and they'll come back, show what they caught, and they get prizes for the biggest fish, the most fish, etc. There's the challenge of fooling the fish, and that's trying to put on something that's wood and metal and painted and throw it out there, and a fish bites it, and you said, ha, you fell for it again, didn't you? There's the thrill of catching a bigger fish. And so I'm sure if two of you are out fishing and one of you catches a fish, he's going to say, mine's bigger than yours is. And she's going to say, nope, I got a bigger one. And there's also the fun of using the lightest line possible, but to be able to get it in without breaking the line. So Some people have used, in some countries, they train otters or eels and they have them on a line. So they go out, catch a fish, they drag them in and then take it out. This is a different way of fishing in which they actually put a tiny bait fish, tie it to the line, and then put a fish hook behind it. And they're fishing for a fish that eats fish. And it grabs this. And it's really a fun way of fishing in Japan. This is purely Japanese. So here's how they fish. They have this long pole. There's no reel or anything else. This huge long pole, and it's got that little fish in, and then they flip it up and catch it in a net. I just love watching it. Wouldn't this be fun? And and they're fishing for this little tiny fish. It can't be of much value. It wouldn't be able to eat much, but it is a traditional sport. Okay. So that's the end. I'll be happy to take any questions. I want you to be thinking about the things you've learned here and how that's going to apply to your fishing in the future, both looking at the size of the mouth, knowing the kind of fish that are there, and then figuring out what they're going to eat and how you're going to catch them.